If you're listening to this podcast, it's probably because a child you love and care for is differently wired. Are they also struggling in their current educational setting, seen only for what they're doing wrong while longing for positive relationships with peers and others? Envision a world where your child's unique abilities are not just recognized, but celebrated. A world where they can connect with others and their true potential is seen and appreciated. The Strength-Based Assessment Lab's mission is to build a world for your child just like that. Through its innovative approach, it aims to empower students, families, educators, and professionals to create positive, effective, and collaborative learning experiences. Be a part of shaping a brighter future for your child. Visit www.bgs.edu to learn more about what a strength-based assessment could mean for your family. That's bgs.edu.
You want to spend maybe 20% of your time working on a relative weakness. But you really want to spend about 80% of your time working on a relative strength, because that is where a child is going to get their identity, to feel good about themselves, and to be able to do something, even as something else might be hard, but to be able to do something where they can invest themselves and fly.
Welcome to the Tilt Parenting Podcast, a podcast featuring interviews and conversations aimed at inspiring, informing, and supporting parents raising differently wired kids. I'm your host, Debbie Reber, and today I'm talking with Dr. Gail Saltz, a psychiatrist, speaker, podcaster, media commentator, and an expert on a variety of psychological and mental health issues. She's also the author of the new book, The Power of Different, The Link Between Disorder and Genius, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. In our conversation, Dr. Saltz and I talk about the connection between neurodiversity and strengths, how kids can be best primed to tap into their gifts and reach their full potential, what needs to happen to eliminate the stigma associated with being differently wired, and much more. I hope you enjoy our conversation. And before I get to our conversation, I wanted to let you know I've just launched my new After the Show video series. These are 2 to 3 minute videos where I highlight key takeaways from the conversations I have with my guests, or give you tips about how to take what you've learned and make it work for your family. So after you've listened to this episode, go to tiltparenting.com/aftertheshow to watch the episode stemming from my conversation with Dr. Saltz, and sign up to get new episodes of the podcast and After the Show series delivered to your inbox each week. And now I'll get on with the show. Hi, Dr. Saltz. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we have a lot to get through, and you are a busy woman, so I want to dive right in. And I'd love to start by just talking about your new book, The Power of Different. I'm curious to know, what was your inspiration for writing this particular book? You've worked in so many different areas of mental health, and I'd love to know the story for this particular book.
Sure. This book has been definitely percolating in my mind for many years, fueled by a combination of things. One is that I have felt for a very long time that we have a very unidimensional way of looking at mental health issues, informed greatly by stigma, that, there's sort of this very negative view of being different in any way from others. And while mental health issues can definitely cause suffering, and I'm in the business of treating that, and I think people should get treatment, and I don't want to minimize the suffering, it is really clearly more complex than that, as I have seen in many years of practice where I treat many actually very high functioning people who are really successful but are suffering nonetheless. Obviously, the reason they come to see me. And I was really struck by how many people found ways to use a very particular strength that was associated very much so with the issue that they were struggling with. So that became apparent to me during practice. Then I started hosting a series at the 92nd Street Y called Psychobiography, where we explore what made someone tick, but that subject was, or is, I should say, it's ongoing, a person who has been highly successful, really at a genius level in terms of changing our world in the arts or in the sciences or in history, and found that pretty much anybody I chose that sort of uniformly is recognized at that level, had a mental health issue. So I was really struck by that. And I've always been fascinated with the subject of genius and extraordinary creativity and achievement, probably somewhat informed by having grown up with a brother who actually won the Nobel Prize at age 41, which is one of the youngest people. He's an astrophysicist. And, I've always been very fascinated by the way he thinks and his creativity and his curiosity and sort of what goes into making someone like that.
Wow. If you could see my face when you said 41 winning the Nobel Prize astrophysicist, that's incredible. And wow. Yeah. My son will be really excited to hear that because he is all about astrophysics. That's awesome.
Yeah. You can tell him if he has interest in this area of the expanding universe and dark energy, that was the work.
So cool. So cool. So I'm curious about this term genius. What does that mean when you say that?
So, I'm trying to be careful in the book to say that really, I think that there is genius with a capital G, which is really, I think, reserved for people who have thought of something that really changed the trajectory of their field and of our world, and is so, out of the box, uniquely different in terms of their thought process, that, they're at the end of that bell-shaped curve, really. And they're probably a couple of standard deviations off of it. But I also wanted to include extraordinary achievement. And so I'd call that genius with a small g, that there are many people who really have a very particular strength that they apply in a certain arena that has allowed them to come up with some, very creative, innovative thoughts that lead to real achievement in an area. And, they may not be off the charts in terms of, the Leonardo da Vinci's or the Albert Einsteins, but, they do have extraordinary ability.
Right. Okay. That makes sense. I'd love to talk more about that connection between difference and strength. We had a guest on the show a couple months ago who we talked about the connection between neurodiversity and creativity. And one of the things that stayed with me from our conversation was that if you have a child, for example, in a classroom who is really struggling to fit into the norms of a traditional education and there's something going on, then we should be thinking, that must be a really creative person. Like there's something else going on here. I'm curious to know your thoughts on that and what you see or what you found in your research about that connection between someone who is differently wired and then having these maybe unusual strengths.
So I think you can't say it's always and it's across the board. But what I did find, and I, really looked at numerous studies and data to support it, is that this occurs on what is called a U-shaped curve. So it seems that if you had to make a sweeping statement, which, I try not to do very often, and really try to look at individual wiring issues. But if you do look across the board, you would find that people who are severely impaired, so maybe they are suffering from symptoms as a result of a difference in wiring, but it is probably, I'm talking about often untreated and causing real impairment, and therefore at the more severe end or the top of the U-shaped curve, those people are really not able to manifest whatever strengths they might have because of the impairment. But also, if you look at the other side of the top of that U, which is people who don't have anything different going on, they don't have different wiring, they sort of fall into, they appear fairly symptom-free perhaps, but also don't have this difference. they too seem to have lower rates of particular kinds of strengths. Creativity is often one of them, but there are others. And if you look at the bottom of the U, which is people who have mild to moderate differences and mild to moderate symptoms with those differences, they seem to have higher rates, significantly higher rates of creativity, of whatever if we could be looking at different areas, so it depends on what's causing the problem in the classroom. Is it an attentional issue? So they have high distractibility, which may be due to wiring, for example, in the default network of the brain, which regulates one's ability to decide when to attend and not to attend. And as a result of that wiring, they also have differences in wiring, which lead to increased number of unusual out-of-the-box thoughts. They're often contained in daydreams and such, and they have an ability to piece together those thoughts to come up with what end up being very productive ideas if they're not too impaired. And so you find that a lot of people who really excelled in the past, and even at genius level, at extraordinary levels, in the arts and in the sciences, often fit into that middle of that U-shaped curve where they have these very particular wirings that lead them to have those strengths.
It's so interesting. A lot of our audience here, it's comprised of kids who are kind of, I call them stuck. A lot of our kids have invisible differences. They're the kids who seem like they should be fitting in fine, but for whatever reason, they are struggling in a traditional classroom. We have a lot of parents with kids who have ADHD, a lot of twice exceptional kids that our parents are raising. And so I guess I have a twofold question. One is, what do our kids need in order to feel supported in having what they need to uncover perhaps that untapped greatness, or if there is genius within? And then also, what should parents be doing to make sure that their kids are reaching their potential? It's a big question, I know.
It is a big question, and rightfully so. Unfortunately, our current educational system, wonderful in some ways, is really lacking in dimensionality. That, there are a certain set of standards. It's totally uniform. Everybody's supposed to jump through the same hoop, on their way to the next place, and that's what they're rewarded for. And we don't, in our current system, have much understanding of and allowances for the fact that many kids will be what I would call angular. Their relative strengths and relative weaknesses are pretty disparate. So it's not that they're, pretty good at a lot of things and not too terrible at many things, but instead they have some profound weaknesses in certain areas. If it's a learning issue, that might be a very targeted issue like reading or, speed of reading or auditory processing. Or it may be, as you brought up, a problem with distractibility and impulsivity related to, wiring issue in the default network. Or it may be an anxiety issue, which is very common in childhood. 1 out of every 5 kids will have an anxiety disorder at some point. But it means that they are prone to having certain areas in school be very difficult, and other areas that they have potential extreme strength in may mean they're really good in one subject and not so good at others. Or it may mean that they have a particular issue that's interfering with many subjects because of the way that they're being taught very specifically. Maybe teachers are using only, auditory. They just lecture in front of a class. There's nothing visual, and they have visual strengths as a learner, but they can't tap into that. So just, there's so many different possibilities, but suffice it to say that this uniformity, along with any lack of insight into what your child's strengths might be. So this is where I often say, if you as a parent become aware that your child is struggling, obviously, I would say to you, an evaluation to look at what the struggle's about and whether there is a treatment, that wouldn't be too difficult to get, which often is the case, to be honest, that would help them. I'm all for that, as is anybody in the mental health arena. But at the same time, I feel like that's where we are right now. If there's something really severe, then it might get picked up and it might be looked at and it might be treated. And that's good, but it's missing the whole half that has to do with, and what are those child's particular strengths? So it's important for a parent to be able to expose their child to numerous things and look for what does work for them and what does light their fire. And often neuropsych testing, if it's not very apparent, is really helpful for that, because it doesn't just identify weaknesses, it does also identify strengths. And to be able to go back to your school, and this is what's hard, because some schools are more amenable to others, to be perfectly honest. But, the more that you can make a relationship with a teacher and show them very specifically where your child's strengths lie and say, for example, would it be possible for Stephen to approach projects that you assign with this in mind, that, this is hard for him, but this is really where he can show you what he knows in a creative way. And, can we work together to see if there are methods of letting him do the work in such a way that he could really show you what he knows? A lot of teachers are excited by that and would if they had that liaison going on. But as a parent, I certainly advise you to make every effort to make that happen.
We'll be right back after this quick break. Darren and I are prepping for a big move at the moment, so we are fully leaning into any and everything that simplifies things, and that absolutely includes mealtimes. At a time when my executive functioning skills are being pushed to the limit, even planning and executing dinner for our family these days can feel like a really big lift. That's why I'm especially grateful for Green Chef, a meal service that offers pre-measured and prepped ingredients to my door. Each box is packed with foods you can feel good about, like whole fruits and vegetables, plus lean protein and whole grain options. In fact, one of the things I love most about Green Chef is that they offer options that prioritize gut and brain health, with science-backed recipes that feature ingredients like fiber, antioxidants, and omega-3 fatty acids. During this time of lots of stress, it feels really grounding to know we're supporting ourselves nutritionally. I will take all the support I can get. And Green Chef doesn't just cover dinner recipes. I can add high-quality breakfasts, lunches, and snacks to my weekly box from Green Market. Green Chef has a special offer for Tilt listeners. Go to greenchef.com/tilt50 and use code TILT50 to get 50% off plus 20% off your next 2 months. That's 50% off plus 20% off your next 2 months when you use the code TILT50 at greenchef.com/tilt50. Green Chef, the #1 meal kit for eating well. Maybe I've watched too many seasons of The Amazing Race, but every time I have to go somewhere on the subway, I treat it like a competition. It's all about making the right gut decisions about which route will get me there the fastest. Sometimes those decisions get me where I'm going early, and other times my gambles don't really pay off. Probiotics can't help with most gut decisions, but if your gut needs a little support, Ritual has your back. Their Synbiotic Plus, a 3-in-1 supplement, has clinically studied prebiotics, probiotics, and a postbiotic to support a balanced gut microbiome. I've been using Synbiotic Plus for about 6 months now, and it's become a core part of my morning routine. I take the mini capsule every morning while making my way through my inbox, whether I'm at home or I'm on the road, because it doesn't need to be refrigerated. And the capsule itself is delayed released, which helps it survive the harsh conditions of the upper GI tract for delivery to the colon. And that's exactly where we want it to go. Ritual invested in a study modeling the human colon, which showed that Synbiotic Plus significantly increased microbial diversity and the growth of beneficial bacteria. There's no more shame in your gut game. Synbiotic Plus and Ritual are here to celebrate, not hide your insides. Get 25% off your first month for a limited time at ritual.com/tilt. Start Ritual or add Synbiotic Plus to your subscription today. That's ritual.com/tilt for 25% off. Yeah, I'm curious to know more about the the testing, or just talk about that a little more. I've had a couple experts on the podcast talk about evaluations, the diagnostic process, and a lot of people are kind of anti-label or don't want to test. They don't want to go down that road for various reasons. I hear that from listeners. I have listeners all over the world, and I know certain countries it's more of a liability than in others to have a label attached. And so what are your thoughts on kind of the cost benefit of having that? I think I know your answer, but I want to know a little bit more of the benefits of having those neuropsych evaluations done and when they should happen and how a child can really benefit from that.
So, a good neuropsychological evaluation isn't really designed to produce a label. It's actually designed to show where relative strengths and weaknesses are, whether we're talking about, how are one's spatial relations ability? How are one's verbal abilities? How are one's math abilities? How are one's, and it gets obviously much more subtle than that, is the reading issue have to do with speed, decoding, it gets very specific. And that's not to say that therefore here's the diagnosis. Sometimes it's helpful to have a diagnosis because, of course, unfortunately, and this is why, by the way, I break the book into symptoms, not diagnoses. Why? Because diagnoses are limited. They're the language we have to use to talk with schools, insurance companies, clinicians sometimes use to talk to each other. But they're really rudimentary, and they are not. I think they will be changing. It's not really the language of the future in terms of how we understand brain wiring. Symptoms, on the other hand, are. So, if your child is anxious or, why is your child anxious? Is it because it takes them a really long time to read something and they're aware that they're not where somebody else is in the reading, and that makes them anxious? And then why is that? What is happening in the reading? So breaking it down into little bite-sized pieces at the same time that the testing will show you a strength that might not be being uncovered in the classroom, a potential for a place to excel. And that is very important because while you do want to spend, I spoke with many people, who are sort of on the forefront of this area in working with kids, who are on the autism spectrum, who are, struggling with an attentional issue. You want to spend maybe 20% of your time working on a relative weakness, but you really want to spend about 80% of your time working on a relative strength, because that is where a child is going to get their identity, to feel good about themselves, and to be able to do something, even as something else might be hard, but to be able to do something where they can invest themselves and fly. So part of the problem with diagnoses is, as you're alluding to, is they're so attached to stigma. They're so attached to this negative way of thinking, and parents understandably don't even want to go there because it feels like some sort of a death sentence to be presented with this diagnosis as if this means now your child can never be successful. And really my point in showing all this data is that's simply not true. But it is important to know where things stand. Genius is not about IQ. IQ points are one measure of something, but they are really just one. And in fact, if you look at historically at people who have extraordinarily high IQs, 140, 150, some of them really have trouble being successful people because there's some other issues that seem to come along with extremely high IQ. You do need a certain amount of intelligence to manifest a certain amount of success, but it's not as high as most people think of, being extremely smart. And so it's not that I'm saying get testing and tell your child every single bit of information, because testing is data driven, but it also has a clinical component where somebody's sitting down and looking at the whole package of your kid with this data and making sense of it. And just throwing numbers out is not that useful. So you need a good tester who isn't just farming it out to an intern and saying, just give me the numbers and then we're going to say something about it. You need somebody who is sophisticated in testing and can put together what they're seeing with the child and what's happening in the classroom and what's happening at home with the data that becomes available. But that data is really useful in terms of identifying very particular strengths and then guiding in terms of how to play to those strengths.
I love what you said about the 20-80 ratio. I haven't heard it like that before. I mean, it's pretty clear that a lot of just the traditional education model does seem to be very much of a deficit space, like, oh, you're struggling with this. Let's put all our efforts into that. And I like flipping it on its head. And that's just a good number to have in mind too, just that 20%. I think that's a really nice benchmark and something that I homeschool my differently wired child, but that's something I'll keep in mind too, in terms of the ratio. I just have a question about education, just wanting to know your thoughts. Can be challenging to find the right fit for a lot of kids who are differently wired in a traditional setting. Many of us end up homeschooling. It sounds like you're a proponent of being a strong advocate for your child in a traditional school setting. Have you found any school settings or maybe educational philosophies that tend to work better for kids who are angular thinkers, angular learners?
Well, generally speaking, it's the more children in a classroom per teacher, the more difficult that can be to do. And the more administratively the school isn't willing to think this way, just basically saying, there are schools who say, like, we're just not equipped to deal with kids with differences. And obviously that's going to be a problem. But I think there are schools. And so this is, if you're looking at schools, obviously, you really want to ask them point blank, not that you're saying to the school, like, my child is the only child, so, make it all about them. But is there flexibility in the system? I guess I would say that's the biggest component. Is there flexibility so that you can communicate with a teacher and talk about how some things can be individualized to allow your child, not don't do that project, but, can you brainstorm and come back to the teacher with possibilities of ways to do that project. And, I don't know that I could tell you across the board, this is the model, because I can't say that I've seen one. There are children who, because of what's going on with them, don't do well in an extremely unstructured setting. And then there are children who, because of what is particularly going on with them, don't do well in a particularly rigid setting. And again, testing can be helpful to give you some ideas as to which direction to go in, but it can be individual.
Great. Thank you for that. I want to make sure that we get to talk about your book a little bit more before we go. So could you tell us about your book, The Power of Different? We know the inspiration for it. Who's it written for, and kind of what do you hope it does in the world? It's
written for a lay public. I definitely wanted this to be accessible to anybody who's struggling with something, or loves someone who's struggling with something. I wanted parents to feel comfortable, being able to digest and think about this for their child. And so it's really for everybody, but it does have, the real science in it. It's not a story. I really back it up with a lot of data. And I broke it down by, as I mentioned earlier, symptoms, so that if the issue is a learning difference, if the issue is distractibility of certain sorts, if it's anxiety or melancholy or cycling mood or divergent thinking even, and then, of course, I looked at autism as well in terms of difficulty relating to others. So I tried to frame this so that people would sort of know where they're fitting, because people aren't diagnoses, people experience symptoms. And then I interviewed many people who are extraordinary achievers. Definitely, many of the genius level. I have Nobel Prize winners in here, and others who you may not have heard of. They're not the Einstein, that obviously, but you may or may not have heard of them. Some you may have, David Sedaris. Some you may not have, the most decorated paleontologist in the nation. But they all struggled with a real mental health issue, and I think it gives you a flavor of what it's like to struggle with that, and at the same time to uncover and understand what actually your strength is and how they did that. I talked to many children who are really gifted children, clearly, excelling in various educational environments, but clearly also suffer with a real symptom. And so I try not to, I'm careful not to really minimize what it means to suffer and what it means to be stigmatized, which is the other big point of the book, which is, we are really still stigmatizing these issues. Besides the fact that it keeps many people from seeking treatment, those that do often feel shamed. They feel shamed, their parents feel shamed. And honestly, this does nothing for anyone. It's a real deterrent from careful care. It's a real self-esteem crusher. And so my hope in writing this is that people would understand the reality that many of these people are the ones that we frankly look up to and are amazed by what they have accomplished in their lives and how invaluable that's been to our society. We just didn't know that they struggled in silence with this issue, which caused a lot of suffering.
We'll be right back after this quick break. Hey there, it's Debbie. I love making this show and sharing conversations about how to support our awesome neurodivergent kids. I've seen how even one little insight from an interview can spark a big shift in daily life. But I know that raising complex kids can be messy and lonely. And just when we think we figured it out, something comes up that boots us right back to feeling overwhelmed and stuck. That's why I've poured everything into creating a way for parents like us navigating complex parenting journeys to join together and chart a path that feels positive, hopeful, and doable. It's the brand new Differently Wired Club experience. In the club, you'll get personal support from me and other seasoned parent coaches, 6 live calls every month where you can connect and get your personal questions answered, the opportunity to learn directly from authors and experts like I have on this show, monthly themes for getting specific and tactical, an exclusive private podcast feed, and the best, most generous community of parents. Seriously, these folks show up for themselves and each other, and that right there is really everything, because it's a daily reminder that we're not alone. Our kids aren't broken, and we have totally got this. The recently rebooted Differently Wired Club is on a brand new platform with its very own iOS and Android app. It is such a great space. However you learn, whatever your style, no matter the ages, genders, and neurodivergent profile of your children, the Differently Wired Club can help you cultivate the positive shifts you're hoping for. Join us today by going to tiltparenting.com/club. That's tiltparenting.com/club. I hope to see you on the inside.
If you like this show, there's a decent chance you'll also enjoy the Shameless Mom Academy. Hi, I'm Sarah Dean, the founder and host of the Shameless Mom Academy. The Shameless Mom Academy is a podcast for moms that centers moms more than it centers your kids. I'm not going to teach you how to make baby food or how to make your 3-year-old or 13-year-old stop having tantrums. Instead, I'm going to bring you back to yourself. For the last 20 years, I've been helping moms through growth and transformation. Inside the Shameless Mom Academy, I help you identify who you are and who you are becoming. Look, motherhood is hard. It brought me to my knees many times and sometimes still does. Returning to who I am and who I am becoming allows me to decide how to show up in all those sticky motherhood moments, but also in all my other relationships and in all the ways I show up in my various communities. So come check out the Shameless Mom Academy wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm willing to bet you'll leave feeling a little inspired and maybe even completely fired up. And you'll probably laugh a few times because I promise we never take ourselves too seriously over here. With 700 episodes to choose from, you're likely going to find something that sparks and speaks to you inside the Shameless Mom Academy.
I love that message so much. I think that's why, one reason why I was so thrilled to have you on the show. I really resonate with your book and this message and the conversation around stigma and shame. And that's a big inspiration for why I created Tilt, was to try to change the way neurodiversity is experienced in the world by neurodivergent people and the parents raising the millions of kids around the world who are unique and extraordinary. I'm just curious to know, what do you think would be kind of some of the most powerful ways to change the conversation? I'm trying to help parents own up to what's happening in their lives, to speak out, to not hide in secrecy about what's going on, but to be real and open about what's going on and embracing who our kids are. What do you see as some of the biggest game changers to really shift the way diversity is perceived?
Well, I do think talking about it is probably the most important thing, as you're pointing out. I think talking about it backed with real information so that it's not just people saying, I want it to be okay, but, understanding the ways in which it can be a real strength. I don't want to say that people who don't have a difference can't be creative, because of course they can, but they actually may not have the edge that many people who are struggling with something like this do have. It's part of the reason that evolutionarily these things have stuck around. And that if we could talk more openly about it, more people would get help for the things that are hampering them or causing suffering for them. And that would be, frankly, better for all of us, because the rates are such that pretty much every single person knows or loves someone who is in a struggle. And so these are not small numbers. Close to 50% of Americans at some point in their life will have a mental health diagnosis. And that means that pretty much 100% of us are affected. Depression is the number one source of disability in this country, and billions of dollars are lost in productivity. And often it's because people wait so long to get treatment because they don't want to tell others, and they don't even want to tell themselves that they're struggling. So I think that if more people could share, since we know the numbers are this high, that frankly it would desensitize us to the idea that this is odd or, unusual and, a terrible handicap. If we could talk about it in the biologic sense that it exists, which is, these are differences in brain wiring, changes in neurotransmitters, just like no one would be ashamed to say, I just got diagnosed with diabetes. I just got diagnosed with heart disease. I have to attend to this because I will feel better and I will live longer and I will live more productively. And I do think a part of that is understanding what you might be able to play to enhance your situation, which is the strengths that come with this different wiring.
That's great. Thank you. Well, I want to respect your time. We're coming up on a half hour, but I would love to just share with listeners where they can find you. You have a podcast, you have a lot of resources on your website. So what's the best way for people to connect?
Sure. I have a website at www.drgailsaltz.com. People can tweet me at Dr. Gail Saltz. I do answer things, and I have a Facebook page. The book they can find pretty much wherever books are sold, certainly on Amazon and Barnes & Noble, but many bookstores are covering it. I'm trying to get out there and talk to educators and frankly anyone who is aware that this issue is affecting them. So I have a year coming up with many, many talks, and I hope people will engage in the conversation.
That's exciting. Well, congratulations on the book, and I hope your message just reaches so many people. It's such important work. And listeners, I'll leave links for all these resources on the show notes so you don't have to be madly scrambling these things down. And Dr. Saltz, thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast today. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for having me and for sharing the message.
You've been listening to the Tilt Parenting Podcast. For the show notes for this episode, including links to Dr. Saltz's website, her books, her Power of Different podcast, and the rest of the resources mentioned in our conversation, visit tiltparenting.com/session82. And don't forget to check out my After the Show short video where I share my top takeaways from my conversation with Dr. Saltz. You'll find a link on the show notes page, or you can go straight to tiltparenting.com/aftertheshow. And a quick invitation to try our free Differently Wired 7-day challenge if you haven't gone through it yet. When you sign up, I'll email you a short, inspirational video every day for 1 week with a tip you can incorporate into your life right away to shift your experience in a positive way. You'll also be invited to join a private Facebook group for people who've gone through or are doing the challenge. More than 800 people have gone through the challenge so far. It's free, it's ongoing, and it's designed to help you find some more peace and confidence in your parenting journey today. To join, visit tiltparenting.com/7day. If you like what you heard on today's episode, consider subscribing or leaving a review on iTunes. Both things help our podcast get noticed in the crowded podcast space. Thanks again for listening. For more information on Tilt Parenting, visit www.tiltparenting.com.
Hey, are you a parent of a teenager? Are you feeling overwhelmed about how to be what they need while also holding limits and boundaries that keep them safe? Are you tired of conversations that negate how messy this season of parenting is? Well, I've got you. My name is Casey O'Rourke. I am a positive discipline trainer, parent coach, and the host of the Joyful Courage podcast. Every week, I come to you with an interview digging into tough topics with experts I trust and solo shows that go deep into the personal growth and mindset needed to raise teens in a way that grows them into confident, capable young people. I am not afraid of getting real about the intersection of conscious parenting and the teen years, while also bringing in vulnerability, humor, and lightness. I'm walking the path with you and honored to serve. Listen to Joyful Courage on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you consume podcasts.